So today's topic is adapting the Ashtanga Yoga practice to our menstrual cycle as well as to the lunar cycle. So this is going to be a bit of a comprehensive guide for us female practitioners to just adapt the Ashtanga practice to the different phases of our menstrual cycle, and also to adapt it to the lunar cycle, because some of us aren't menstruating or we're men, and so we still need to kind of have a way of adapting our practices to live more in rhythm with the entire cosmos. So the goal is that the path of yoga isn't just this straight linear line where you practice all the time endlessly despite life being in this spiral. So basically, by honoring these rhythms in both ourselves as well as the cosmos, the practice is transformed in these three fundamental ways. So we need to know why it's important before I give you the exact how. So the first reason is that the practice begins to become this dance between Abhasa and Vairagya. So in chapter 1, which is the Samadhipada of Patanjali Yoga Sutras, verse 12 says, Abhyasa Vairagyabhyam Than Nirodha, which basically means that the fluctuations of the mind are stopped by two things: practice, which is abhyasa, and non-attachment, which is vairagya. So now the mind is still through simultaneous application of both this effortful, striving nature of the practice, as well as this attitude towards it, which is surrendered detachment. So you're putting in as much effort as you can, but simultaneously holding the sense that, it doesn't matter ultimately. It's very lightly held. And so this cyclical approach is this living embodiment of Abhyasa Vairagya, because sometimes you're doing this dynamic, strength-building practice on the follicular and ovulatory phases. I'm going to get into that in a minute. And that becomes this powerful expression of the way to have effortful practice and apply Abhyasa. But however, on the flip side, we also end up on the days when, we are on moon days or we're just in the premenstrual phase, we start to train Vairagya, which is the other aspect of it. So this is not like being lazy or just giving up. It's more like detachment from seeing ourselves that way. Seeing and being detached from ambition, from striving, from always being on. So it's hard, it's very hard to choose rest when your ego wants to practice 6 times a week, when it wants to get better, when it always wants to be go, go, go. So to modify and to make it easier when you feel like you should be stronger, you should be doing more, is to surrender your own personal will to the larger natural rhythm that we're talking about. So the rhythm of the cosmos and the rhythm of our natural women's cycles. And this is a far more challenging and advanced practice to do, because it doesn't just mean that you push through and unlock asanas. It means that you should actually truly be allowed to let go as well in order to get to this state of true integration, of true yoga. So by spiraling through these states of Abhyasa and Vairagya, you're no longer just choosing one over the other. So you're not just passively giving up on your practice entirely, and especially after we come out of our cycles, it's the hardest to get back on the mat. So we're not just giving up and being completely detached and just letting go. We are learning to embody both simultaneously, and therefore we're learning how to live from this balanced center, and this is where true yoga really arises. So that's the first reason. The first reason is to balance this dance of Abhyasa and Vairagya. Now the second reason is that the body then becomes the guru. The body then becomes the teacher. And we learn slowly with time to listen to the pranic intelligence. So through this practice of deep listening, we notice that the breath is not just something that accompanies us. It's also like a tool that carries the natural intelligence of the body. So whatever is happening inside is reflected on the breath, and whatever is reflected on the breath also seemingly is reflected on a grander scale. Now, I'm not just saying this to sound esoteric or whatever. It's that this menstrual cycle that we go through naturally is a physical manifestation between this downward flowing energy, or apana vayu, and vayus are kind of like the winds in our body, and there's 2 main winds, and actually 5, but the 2 main winds are apana vayu, which is this downward flowing energy, and prana vayu, which is the upward flowing energy. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to balance these two vayus, but the moon cycles, interestingly, also reflect the same energetic tide, but on a cosmic level. So it's not just that during your cycle as a woman, we're influenced by these two pranic forces. It's also that on a cosmic scale, the moon cycles reflect the same energetic tide. So by adapting your practice to not being this like rigid external structure that you impose upon your body, you slowly start to learn how to listen to it. And you learn how to discern when the prana is high and expansive and it's like in this pranic mode. And then you also learn when your apana is dominant, when your apana is functioning in your body, that's kind of taking you more towards rest, towards grounding, towards relaxation. So now, if you actually learn this properly, your mat becomes a space just for listening to yourself, not for saying no matter what's happening on a cosmic level and on my own natural level, I'm not going to just see this as, like a thing to be powered through, not an inconvenience. Like being on your cycle is not an inconvenience, so you can't practice all the time. And going through like a full moon phase where all the energy is high and everyone's agitated and restless isn't like an inconvenience that's taking you out of your practice on a random Wednesday like this week. So what we have to realize is that they are basically direct communications from our body to our innate wisdom. And so the practice then becomes this response to this wisdom. And if you do it this way, genuinely, your sensitivity will begin to deepen and your body itself will become this trusted teacher. And of course, the moon cycles are fixed. We can go on Google and find out when is new moon, when is full moon, and kind of alter our practices towards this natural rhythm of the cosmos. The third and final reason, just to recap, first reason, Abhasa Vairagya. Second reason, to listen to the prana's intelligence. And the third and final reason is to move from asana to awareness. So a lot of us, especially when we do something as challenging and demanding and structured as Ashtanga, we can kind of get caught on the level of the asana. Now, what the true purpose of yoga is of course Kaivalya, which is realization that our true nature is Purusha. It's this untouched, unchanging, silent consciousness that witnesses all phenomenon. And so this practice of Ashtanga Vinyasa, it can become very much like focused on doing a deep back bend or standing on your hands, or it can inadvertently kind of strengthen our egoism if we don't see this as an opportunity to release that identification. The identification with the person who is achieving the pose, but rather if you actually follow these cycles, if you actually say, okay, sometimes I'm not the yogi that's like able to do deep back bends. So what we need to know is that by rhythmically building up energy and then letting go and like practicing very, very little or not practicing at all, we learn from direct experience that you are not your body and you are not your practice either. So you're not like, just because you do second series, third series doesn't make you a good yogi. It's only when you start to notice that these cycles exist in all of us, and a disciplined yogi is someone who is able to adapt their practice as well and see that you are the awareness that watches these different states arising and passing, just like the different waxing and waning phases of the moon. And so you're not bad to take a day off. You're not undisciplined if you're not able to practice 6 times a week, 365 days a year. So what we need to realize is it's almost permission for ourselves, permission to allow ourselves to say, yes, I am doing my best, I'm showing up as often as I can, but it's not about perfecting my body or achieving this perfect sequence. It's very much a tool to kind of realize my own nature amidst this changing, fluctuating, constantly dipping and changing life. So each spiral of the practice takes you you go deeper, you push for one season, then you rest and you slow down for one season. And this way, it's not a linear path where you're always trying to go further, always unlock the next position, but it becomes this spiral inwards. It becomes this journey towards yourself, and that's ultimately what we want to find, right? We want to use the practice to find that luminous center within us that's already whole, that's already calm, that already has it, instead of reaching for some version of ourselves that's in the future that's perfect. Slowly over time, the practice becomes less about what you do, and it becomes more about remembering who you are, which is the state of the Purusha, untouched, clean, undisturbed by all the flux of life. So one more time, why do we need to honor these rhythms? Because we can play with this dance of Abhasa Vairagya, we can learn to listen to our own pranic intelligence, and we move from asana to awareness of asana itself. And then we remember who we are rather than being attached to our practice. So now, having this as like kind of a preface to what I'm about to say, let's now move into Ashtanga and the links to our menstrual cycles. So our menstrual cycle is obviously very natural rhythm, but Ashtanga Vinyasa is a powerful practice that builds discipline and has a lot of heat-producing effects. And because of this internal heat-producing, tapas-inducing, kind of hardcore nature to the practice, it also cultivates an upward flow of prana. It also invites, like I said, the prana vayu, the upward movement of energy. It's also like linked to our inhale breath. So it's moving from the navel up towards the throat, up towards the crown chakra. But at the same time, it's also important to recognize that we have to be non-violent towards ourselves. This is like one of the foundational things, when we talk about yamas and niyamas, we cannot go ahead into asana according to Patanjali's yoga system if we don't master this sense of non-harming. And so because it's such a core fundamental tenet, I want to invite us to reflect on it once more to say, what does it mean to listen to the natural intelligence of the body? The intelligence of the body that's carried by the breath doesn't ask us to practice all the time, always on, in the same way throughout our cycles. So the menstrual cycle is a fundamental natural intelligence of the female body, and we're really lucky to have it. And it's characterized by the opposite of what we do in the Ashtanga Vinyasa system, which is the downward, outward flow, or the apana vayu. So just to recollect, we talked about the pranic intelligence being shaped both by the cosmic and by the menstrual cycles, but specifically we recognize that the Ashtanga practice moves more in line with the upward flow or the pranic vayu, and our menstrual cycles is moving in the other direction. You see? So there's a conflict there. While our bodies are moving towards apana vayu, our minds or our ambition wants to move towards prana vayu. And so when this conflict happens in us, we have a choice. We either just stop practicing because we feel uncomfortable or lazy, or we just feel like we're not fitting into what Ashtanga requires of us. But if we work with this as a wise practice, then we can work in harmony with this intelligence, not against it. So let's look at how to actually honor the body's needs during the different phases and transform this practice from a rigid discipline to one that's responsive and that's sustainable for our own self-care. So the first phase of our cycle is the menstruation phase. Now this happens from day 1 through day 5. Some of us bleed for 7 days or even longer, but roughly this is a period of release and of grounding. This is the start of our cycle. And the state for us is usually dominated by the strong apanic energy. And the body is obviously shredding its uterine lining. So the energy levels in our body, will notice we feel really low. The body might experience stomach cramping and fatigue. I know I don't even have to tell you, you feel this every month. But basically, it's this primary energetic imprint of out and down and grounding. Yeah, release and grounding. So now the guiding yogic principle I want us to keep in mind during this phase is inviting the sense of ahimsa or non-violence into our practice. So non-violence is just don't be hostile towards anybody, but that starts obviously with ourselves. So don't be hostile towards your own body and its natural processes. Now for the longest time, I used to resist this, and I used to think of my cycle as something that was just like the worst thing to happen to me ever, period. Like, no pun intended. It was like really bad. I was hating it, and I would even, like try and do something, or like try and still be as productive as like on as other stages even during my cycle. But this forcing of a strong heating upward practice during this time itself is a form of violence towards ourselves, because the body's inherent wisdom is telling you slow down, ground, release, don't do. And then your mind is saying no, do more, be more, fit into this box of what Ashtanga is asking you to do. So the principle of surrender is what we need to kind of invite into our practices. So instead of vigorous effort, we need to let go and surrender. So how does this look practically in terms of our practice as recommendations that I would give you? The first few days, so day 1 to day 3, definitely, this is where you probably have your heaviest flow. Just don't even do asana. I know you feel like, but just don't do asana. Some people, to be honest, I must give you this caveat. There are dancers, gymnasts, people who've been doing sport throughout their lives and throughout their period who can manage this. I'm not saying don't do it because it's gonna do something bad or anything. There are people who can manage to practice with their cycle, but as a form of a discipline for yourself, almost like a observance. You're honoring your body's need for rest, for allowing this apana vayu to function without your own mind opposing it. And that's what I want to kind of emphasize. Even if you can, like, just to honor it, this is the ultimate act of listening to your own body's intelligence. So after you finish this 3 days of complete rest, so this is roughly day 4 to day 7, depending on how much your flow is, as long as your heavy flow has subsided, then you can start to practice. But here I would actually move through 4 days of practice, so day 4, day 5, day 6 and day 7, starting off by really simple again. Imagine you're a beginner. Imagine you're coming back to the mat for the first time. Start off with sun salutations, or for you, if you've been practicing full primary this whole year, then start off with less than standing sequence. Like, really give yourself something easy to do. This bar will keep increasing as you practice more, but think of what you can do with your eyes closed on a bad day. Like, that should be your first day's practice. Then add more until you get to day 7, where your bleeding has stopped and you're back to your normal kind of energy levels. But no matter what, avoid inversions. I have read in many other modern texts that this is a myth. This isn't true, that we can do inversions even on our period. I would like you to kind of do your own research, because I'm basing this on some of the recommendations from a very classical textbook. So if you feel like, you can still do inversions and nothing is happening, feel free to do so. But the theory is, and that's all I can present to you, is that when you invert your body, basically you're interrupting the normal menstrual flow, which is downward. And when you put your feet above your head, this rule is like, you're kind of opposing the rule of downward flow of prana. So you're standing in opposition to what's happening naturally in your body. So that's the theory, but you don't have to listen to me if, you have strong evidence against it. The second thing is to avoid strong core work and twisting. Now, our temptation would be to do the same practice that we do every other day of the week on day 4, day 5, day 6, day 7. Because we feel like, okay, I'm no longer bleeding as much, I can go back into what I was doing. Now, this jarring kind of movement into the next phase of our cycle without easing into it is what kind of creates this vritti in our mind that next time we come into the cycle, it gets harder because we make the leap so high. We haven't been practicing, we've been going through PMS, we haven't done it in a while. And then suddenly, right after, the 3rd day, this is one of the mistakes I see, is that we jump straight into what we used to be doing before that whole phase. So in order to practice, you can, by the way, still practice your usual practice, but don't compress your uterine area and interfere with this natural process. So whether you're doing Navasana, maybe, do a bent knee version, lift up very less, or don't even do it, depending on how you're feeling that particular day. But the attitude to the asana is what I want to emphasize here. It's not about the asana, it's more about how you're taking the asana. So basically what I'm saying is, try not to push too hard and don't do Marichasana C and D. Do a more like open twist, like less intense twist. And don't hold Uddiyana Bandha. This is super important because the entire practice, throughout our practice, we've been told suck in the entire abdominal contents up into the thoracic cavity, hold it there for both your inhales and exhales throughout the practice. So this action of sucking up and holding is very, very counter to what's happening when we're on our cycle. So what I would say is, if you need it for some positions, have a gentle firming, but don't do that lifting, hollowing thing that we do with our belly button. So even in Janushirshasana B, try not to put your heel there and, it just leave it alone. Let it do its thing. But fundamentally, the focus should be on grounding and releasing. So whatever poses you're holding, you don't need to hold it for a really long time, because when you hold it for a really long time, it becomes more of like a challenge. We want to make it easy on the body and leave the body less sore after we're done. So holding it for shorter durations is what helps us do that. If you've noticed, when you do a Mysore style class versus a lead class, you'll see sometimes you feel less sore and like less in pain after a lead class than in a Mysore style class. Because in Mysore style, you're often holding it for longer, you're working with the breath, you're pushing yourself, but then it has more intensity because you're holding for longer. So try and do what we do in lead classes, which is soft touch and move on. And focus on grounding the feet into the earth in all of your standing postures. And then when you're doing your seated forward bends, your sitting sequence is highly, highly, highly beneficial. You don't have to do all the postures in the sitting sequence. For example, Ardha Baddha, which invites the heel in towards the groin. You don't have to do that one. But definitely like Paschimottanasana, using blanket or bolster or cushion, that really helps. Janushirshasana, Baddha Konasana. This will definitely keep the postures in its restorative end of the spectrum rather than the strenuous end of the spectrum. And also focus on the hip openers. Holding longer time in Baddha Konasana, gentle things. You don't have to push too hard. But of course it helps when you're bleeding to have a little bit of ease out of that stage. So still I'm talking about day 4 to day 7. This is when you're still bleeding, but after your heavy flow has subsided, you can start your practice, but keep these contraindications in mind so that you're not, pushing yourself in the vinyasas, you're reducing the number of vinyasas, and you're stepping back, you're lowering very little in chaturanga. And this is a true test, guys. If you can do this, during this phase, you're really showing yourself that you're not practicing from your ego, you're practicing out of compassion and self-care, not self-punishment. So that was phase 1. Just to recap, that was days 1 to 5 when you're menstruating, and it's a period of release and grounding. Now phase 2 is our follicular phase, and this phase is when you've stopped menstruating. If your cycle is only 5 days long, then it's day 6 to day 14, depending on how long your cycle is. This is your phase of rebuilding and dynamism. So basically, as we know, biologically, our estrogen levels are rising and we're rebuilding this uterine lining that has just been shed. So we get this surge of energy, we have a sense of optimism, and this dynamism returns. And the energetic sense of us shifts from release or grounding to more building, or back to that pranavaya that I was talking about. And so this is where a practice like Ashtanga is quite cool, because it flows with this natural stage of rebuilding and dynamism. And the guiding yogic principle for this phase of our cycle is Abhasa. So like I said earlier, we have 2 parts of us, the Abhasa part and the Vairagya part. So here is the time to do your Abhasa. It's to be hard on yourself. When your body has energy, do more. Attain steadiness in the shapes. This is an ideal time to re-engage with the full discipline of your practice. So by day 4 of your rebuilding back to where you were, here is when you can do things that you never used to do. For example, in between your transitions, hold an extra second of chaturanga. When you're doing Uttita Hasta, try and get your chin down. Actively re-engage with the discipline, and don't give yourself just leeway to do whatever you want. Explore these postures with enthusiasm and use this renewed energy that your body is naturally giving you to build that sthira, to build that strength. So when it comes to your practice, we want to return to our full practice, like I said, but you're gradually reintroducing it as your energy returns. So take 4 days to ramp up with intensity, like I said. And now your body is in the building phase, and the tapas and the heat and the strength building aspects of the practice will actually feel supportive. So doing Ashtanga during this phase in the way that it's prescribed 6 days a week, don't miss out on this window. And guys, it's as simple as using Apple tracking health. You don't have to download a fancy app or anything like that. Anything basic is enough. You just need to know at any given time which phase are you in. And then when you're in that phase broadly, you need to be able to know what should my practice look like for that day depending on which phase I'm in. And some of us don't know when our cycles are, don't know like which phase of the cycles we're in. And so it feels like this blind spot, and so we're not sure why we're not able to lift up and jump back when we literally just yesterday come out of our menstruation phase. So after this gradual phase of building up, focus on building strength and stamina and fully engage in the vinyasa system. Don't hold back, jump forward, try all the transitions, work on imbalances, explore back bends, embrace the heat basically. And do 𝐿𝐴𝐵𝐿 pranayama, hold the bandhas, do it in the way that it's prescribed. So once you're done with this second phase, so this should be like around 2 weeks, yeah? So this is your follicular phase. Then on day 14, roughly, depending on your cycle, if they're normal, we go into the ovulatory phase. Now this is kind of one more like opening phase that we go into before we start to go down again. And this is where we have a peak of energy and openness. Now, the difference between the previous phase and this phase is that in the previous phase, you'll notice it's much easier to have solidness and sthira, which is like strength in your body. But now in the ovulation phase, you have both strength, which is energy and all that stuff, but also you have softness and openness and availability for the spine to soften, for example. So while your energy is at its peak, because of the hormones that are in our body, we have more flexibility as well, along with that strength and emotional openness. So now is a good time to try new things and be open to new explorations. But the guiding yogic principle for this phase of our cycle is the union of sthira and sukham. So to have both steadiness and ease. And in this phase, because both of these are highly accessible, we should learn how to balance both. So it's not one or the other. Strength is high, but also our tissues are more pliable and we feel a lot more at ease. So we also have that availability of sukham. So don't go too much into one of the extremes. Yeah, this is what you've got to be careful of in this phase. So you could be very much like, okay, I'm just going to do Paschimottanasana or Janushasana and chill out there for like 5 minutes. So catch yourself there and hold strength to counter that. Or if you're being too rigid on yourself, balance that with softness. So explore your edge, but have awareness with it. Your practice will feel exceptionally strong and open. This is the best time. You'll feel amazing, and feel free to explore your heart openers and back bends, but approach that with a sense of like strength. And because this is the caution that I just said, because of the increased like laxity, we could end up overstretching during this phase. So this is second week. This is day 14. You've got to really like utilize your intelligent muscular engagement, work with those antagonist pairs, hold the opposing, like, when you're stretching, also hold strength, and stack your skeletal, body masses before you go into the shape. And this is what we really, really have to do in this phase, which is really, truly balance these two aspects. So that was phase number 3. Just to recap, we went over the phase where we're menstruating, where it's grounding. The second phase, where there's this period of rebuilding and dynamism. Between the first phase and the second phase is the 4 days that you give yourself to build up. And then we looked at the third phase, which is the ovulatory phase, where there's openness. So we've got to balance that openness with strength, or if there's too much strength, balancing it with like openness. And then this is your last fourth phase, which a lot of us don't like. A lot of us have terrible relationships with this phase, myself included, so I can completely understand. I feel like I go from being a teenager to a grandma in like a matter of a few days. So this is the luteal phase of our cycle. And this is a phase of turning inwards. So like I said, it's almost like acknowledging that these are the natural rhythms and to know that we're in this phase. And first step is acknowledging and knowing. My body is literally like making different hormones. I'm no longer making estrogen as much. The progesterone in my body is rising. And so because my body biologically is either preparing for pregnancy or because I'm not having a baby, it's going to prepare for menstruation. It's going through a lot of changes. And because it's going through a lot of changes, it then gives us a time to have like lower energy, less internal heat, and we're more emotionally sensitive. Maybe there's bloating, tenderness, like all of these are classic symptoms of PMS. I'm sure you've experienced it, so I don't even have to tell you. And these characteristic symptoms, though they affect our mood and they affect our practice, so to speak, we can invite a yogic principle to kind of shift that energy. So the guiding yogic principle for this phase is to have pratyahara or sense withdrawal and to do swadhyaya or self-study. Now in the second chapter, which describes the path towards the goal, in the 54th verse, we have what is known as pratyahara as this turtle almost withdrawing its limbs back into the shell. So it's like you're withdrawing your mind from the outside world and pulling it back into yourself. And so this phase naturally calls for a more internal observational practice. And swadhyaya, which is self-study, is the practice of self-reflection. We've got to let go of how it looks on the outside and start to invite these qualities into our practice. So let me be clear. During the luteal phase, I'm not asking you to stop practicing altogether. Because if you do that, then you send the signal to your brain to say, you don't have to practice because you're PMSing. In fact, you need the practice most during the luteal phase. You need to really practice during the luteal phase, but you need to practice completely differently than you think. So this is where you become intelligent and you turn down the intensity and you start listening to your body's signals, because one day you'll feel strong, the next day you'll feel super fatigued and you need a nap. And so you reduce the pace and intensity of your practice and you hold poses for slightly shorter durations. So you won't hold the chaturanga between each vinyasa for an extra count. Instead of like doing things that make you more heated, more intense, you want to go with this direction that the body is going in, because you want to slowly guide your body towards menstruation. There's a lot of people, especially here in Mysore, my friends here, who've been practicing at such a high intensity for so long that it's almost like they don't create the conditions in their body for menstruation to happen because they're practicing 6 days a week like a man does. We are not men, like we can't practice the same way. So we have to kind of turn down like the intensity massively and shut off our egos in order to be able to do this. And we've got to pay attention to the meditative qualities. So same half primary, even if you're doing same half primary, instead of worrying about lifting and jumping back as your main focus, your main focus would be sound of 𝐦𝐤𝐸𝐵 breath in every single position, or meticulous positioning of the drishti. Now these two things, just doing these two things during this phase will counter a lot of the PMS symptoms, because you're taking back control. You're still being disciplined, you're still practicing, but your attitude to the practice is different and it's more meditative. And then you're incorporating a longer shavasana, for example. You're lengthening the time that you're spending in your seated forward folds. And the crucial thing is when you're ramping down the intensity in this way, and this is why I like to have 3 kinds of practices that you do in a week. So you have like really simple practice. Let's say you're doing half primary. Yeah. So because I know everyone here is doing half primary. If half primary is your max practice, that'll be your third practice. Then your second practice should be somewhere around standing sequence, and your first practice should be somewhere around like Parsvottanasana, fundamental sequence. So wherever you are in your practice, I'm sure you can make 3 practices like this. So I want you guys to say in this phase, you want to go from 3, 2, 1, and then menstruation gives you a pause. Don't practice at all. Then you go 1, 2, 3. Does that make sense, guys? On a very practical level, I can't give you exactly because everyone's practicing at a different intensity, but pick 3 sequences and then go down, stop practicing, then go up. By adapting the Ashtanga practice to our menstrual cycle, we transform our practice from this rigid external thing to a living, breathing dialogue with our bodies. And when we intelligently apply these yogic principles, it ensures that our practice remains a source of balance. We can do it long term, and we can sustain it through not only every phase of our cycle, but also every phase of our life, whether we're going through pregnancy or PMS or post-menopause, whatever stage you're not in, any of those stages even, you're still honoring that deep cyclical wisdom that we have within us. So now that I've talked about the menstrual cycles, I wanted to include this second half because some of us aren't menstruating, or maybe we're men, or we have men who want to practice yoga. So in this case, then we need to go beyond our personal rhythm and honor the rhythm of observing the cycles of the cosmos. Specifically, we honor the cycles of the moon. And traditionally, here in Mysore, we don't practice on new moon days and full moon days. And because we don't practice on new moon days and full moon days, it feels like this is some random, arbitrary, archaic thing that was just imposed on us. But more and more, I'm coming to realize, and I haven't in the past, I'm learning this from being here, is that it's actually honoring this deeply rooted yogic energetics. And it's also knowing that we are not alone. And yoga, if yoga means to unite, then we unite to ourselves, but also ultimately to the world around us, right? To the natural world. So the guiding yogic principle for us to kind of honor these celestial cycles is to align with the cosmic prana and this law of opposites. I'm going to unpack this, don't worry. So there are 2 primary forces that govern our energetic system. According to the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, these are the sun force, the solar force, and the lunar force. Now the sun force is called Pingala, and the moon force or the lunar force is called Ida. Now the practice of yoga, specifically Hatha Yoga, and Ashtanga is a form of Hatha Yoga, aims to balance this Ida and this Pingala, this solar energy in us, this masculine energy, and this feminine, softer lunar energy in us. So on a full moon day or a new moon day, so when there's a full moon or there's no moon in the sky, what happens is that these influences of solar and lunar energetic influences are at the highest. And because they're at the highest and they have the strongest force, they also influence our bodies. Since our natural balance is kind of already skewed towards one extreme or the other, either fully solar or fully lunar, what then happens is that when we practice rigorous asana, we could either end up agitating ourselves more because Ashtanga is a already tapas-inducing practice, or when we try to have a hardcore tapas practice when actually the cosmos is in a phase of slowing down and grounding, it can actually feel draining because we're trying to push this boulder up a hill. So I hope this makes sense, guys. We need to just basically know what's happening on a cosmic scale and then try and honor that and recognize and respect that these are cosmic tides that are powerful and obviously influence us. And if they do influence us even in a little bit, even if our willpower is stronger and we can still practice, even if they influence us in a really, really small way, again, it's to check our egos in that way, to not say, oh, I can practice even today, but to honor that, respect that, because this is a lifelong practice. You're not rushing anywhere. So let's talk about the first one where we take a break, which is the new moon. And the new moon is called Amavasya, and this is where there's an inward and introspective kind of energy. And the new moon occurs basically when the sun and the moon are in alignment on the same side of the earth, so we can't see the moon from our perspective. And you go to the sky and it basically looks like there's no moon. But in yogic terms, the energies of the sun and moon are overlapping or combined in a sense. So during this phase, it's a time to empty out, to ground, and just not do as much, because this vital force, this pranic force, is said to be at its lowest on a cosmic scale. So for us, what it happens is that it creates this state that's more conducive to being more grounded, that's more heavy, that's more introspective. So it's a nice time to journal, to set new intentions, and basically do things that Like not to oppose the fact that our bodies feel heavy and lethargic and slow. So because energetically apana is dominant during this time, just like in our menstrual cycle we honor the times when apana was dominant, in our cosmic cycle we also honor in the same way. When apana is dominant, we don't try and impose prana on top of apana. So the guiding yogic principle, like I talked about, is just to practice pratyahara, which is the mind withdrawing from the outside and going inwards. And it naturally supports this inward turning. So maybe just like being quiet in the evening, lighting incense, and having some time for yourself rather than going out, meeting friends, like, or doing vigorous asana practice in a shala, whatever it is. And basically doing subtler internal practices. So the practice on a new moon day is to don't do physical asana basically. That's the primary instruction that we're given, to not do physical asana practice because we're honoring this low energy, and that actually over time it really helps us. And then the second part of this is to embrace the restorative and the contemplative practices, such as a gentle pranayama or meditation if you have it in your practice. You can do self-study or svadhyaya, as well as japa or mantra. So these are the 4 main practices that I would give you if you're starting on a new moon phase of the cycle. Simple pranayama, nadi shodhana is fine, but don't hold it and be masculine with it. Meditation if you're qualified and you have that in your practice, or just sit down quietly, and then studying scripture, understanding your why, and also connecting to whatever mantra or repetitive chant is resonant for you. So that was what to do on an amavasya or on a new moon day. The next one is what to do, and this is the last one, I know we've been listening for a long time, is the full moon, or what to do on a purnima. Now here we have an upward flowing energy. It's highly dynamic, it's highly energized. You'll even notice, when you're going out on the streets, like there's more traffic, people are more angry with each other. It's almost like cutthroat traffic. I've definitely noticed it like this. That's when full moon energy is at its peak. And because the sun and the moon are in opposition and the earth is in between like that, the lunar energy is at its peak. So this phase is energetically aligned with this peak of the inhalation, this pranavayu, and this is a time for fullness, for expansion, and this upward flow of energy. So because the pranavayu is at its highest, we kind of end up being agitated or restless or feeling somehow, some way ungrounded. And so when we do a practice like Ashtanga, that can easily lead to an injury if we're not careful. It's not a good time to practice for that reason, because we risk injury, we risk becoming more agitated, more rajasic, or more like chitta vikshepa, which is a state of scattering, and we become more overstimulated, and we don't want to carry that into our days. And that's why we don't practice. We just say, okay, I know that prana is dominant, I know I could become more agitated, so to prevent myself from being overstimulated, I'm going to not do asana physical practice in the way that I normally do it. And so the guiding principle for this time is to have contentment and to have surrender. Now contentment is just this sense of, I'm not always trying to seek more, do more, or get more. And I know today's a peak energy day. I'm not going to try and push. I'm just going to take rest and be happy with what I've done and where I am in my life. And it's a good time to also do Ishvara Pranidhana, which is not necessarily surrender to any kind of deity or God, but just generally like having more fluidity and ease to this higher power. So by resting, we not only surrendering our own personal ambitions, but we're also honoring the larger rhythm of the universe, and we acknowledge that there's a force that's greater than our own ego-driven desire to practice. So on full moon days, on Purnimas, we rest again from physical asana practice, but we basically can do Yoga Nidra, for example, which quietens the agitations of the mind. You can do long 30-minute, 1-hour Yoga Nidras. You can find them on YouTube. You can do a grounding pranayama like Brahmari pranayama. You can do even Ujjayi pranayama, which can be quite grounding, and like if you want to do something in the morning, or like we talked about previously, you can do chanting or go for a kirtan or any kind of like bhakti oriented practice. But basically between the new moon and the full moon, you'll see you have energy and time to do the same thing, to ramp up and then ramp down. So whether you're going through a menstrual cycle or you're affected by the lunar cycles, we still need to kind of align ourselves with this larger cycle of life. And so by observing the internal cycle and the external cycle, we learn how to move beyond this linear, mechanical, 6 days a week or your bad Ashtangi kind of way to the practice. And it stops being this rigid discipline and it becomes this responsive dialogue. And so by following this rhythmic approach, we can balance the dynamic Abhasa practice and the Vairagya, the restorative practice. And sometimes we're not doing anything at all. But over time, this builds a far more sustainable, far deeper, and more intelligent practice. And it teaches us this yogic lesson that we all need to learn. It's that true wisdom doesn't lie in forcing our will to practice or to be a certain way on the world, but in aligning ourselves gradually with the natural rhythms of life. And so Ashtanga is this living, breathing thing that can seem like it's very rigid, but progress is really measured by actually integrating the body's wisdom, understanding both menstrual and cosmic cycles, and ultimately working and living with this living spiral. So whichever part of the month or whichever phase of the lunar cycle you're in, just remember it's always this journey back and from the center point of stillness. And so to honor these rhythms is really important, and that's the way we can fundamentally transform our practices.